Hi, welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. 3 months ago, after the Hamas massacre in Israel on October 7th, but before Israel even began its ground operation in Gaza, I had the pleasure of having Victor Davis Hanson on the show. Professor Victor Davis Hanson is a senior fellow for military history and the classics at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. He's an old friend of mine, and he's a great understander, I guess you would say, of what's happening in the United States and the Western world today and where Israel and the Jewish state fits into all of it. So I'm really pleased to revisit all of these issues with him 3 months into this war, when it seems that the Biden administration is doing a full court press to get Israel to just capitulate and leave. So I wanted to talk to him, and I was so happy when he said he could make time available to be on the show again. So first of all, I want to thank you so much, Victor, for joining me again on the Caroline Glick Show.
Well, thank you for having me, Caroline.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and it's a double pleasure to have you on the show. I want to talk to you about what we're seeing from the Biden administration and their real efforts to try to get Israel to capitulate through this half-baked hostage deal, which would see Israel give away thousands and thousands of terrorists that it has imprisoned in its jails, including people who were involved in the October 7th slaughter in exchange for hostages, but also then agreed to essentially end the war in defeat. So I want to get to that, but I want to get to that by way of what's happening in the United States. And you wrote a very important article, I think, in American Greatness earlier in January called "The Culture in Collapse," about what you describe as America's cultural collapse. So I wanted to start with that, because it seems to me that the best way to understand what's happening vis-a-vis America's treatment of Israel under the Biden administration is to understand America's treatment of America. And so, you write a couple of things here that I wanted to just start with. You said, what is happening to us is not due to an adherence to a strict conservative tradition, but is almost exclusively, and now I'm trying to understand what I read in my handwriting. It's almost exclusively a result of the Progressive Project. So first of all, what is the Progressive Project?
We call it the woke movement, with the diversity, equity, inclusion movement, cultural Marxism. But essentially, the common bond that ties all of these variants together is the government feels that it needs enough power to coerce people to be equal, not on the front side of opportunity, but on the back side of result. And when that does not happen, then it uses coercive measures. And so almost every issue that is plaguing America can be traced back to that font. So the border. If we had 8 million Israelis coming across the border, we would close it in 2 seconds. But we are trying to import people from the third world who have grievances apparently against us as a Western nation, and they seem to be useful for the left. If we see crime in the big city we have statutes to stop carjacking or smash and grab, but they're not being enforced on the theory that wealthy white males don't steal Adidas, and therefore they make laws against people who need to steal, that kind of critical legal theory. And the same thing on the universities. So almost every issue that's energy, foreign policy, it all is traced back to dividing the world into this artificial binary of victim, victimizer, oppressor, oppressed. And everybody talks about it, but when you see it and hear it, it was gradually going, to quote Hemingway. Then when it just happens abruptly, as it has the last 2 years, or post George Floyd, it's pretty scary. We're in a revolution, 360-degree revolution that changed the name of the founding date.
That was my second question, actually, because you wrote that. You said some of the decay is existential and fundamental, and some is anecdotal and illustrative. But either way, while the decline came about gradually over decades, its sudden and abrupt chaos during the 3 years of Biden's presidency has shocked Americans. And the question that I have is, what happened all of a sudden that we did see this cultural decline going back to, I guess, the 1960s? And Alan Bloom wrote the
Closing of the American mind, yeah.
What is
Yes.
The closing of the American mind exactly back in the 1980s when he was talking about the university's decline into cultural Marxism. But this was more gradual and in a way gentler, although it was hard if you were Jewish since the beginning of the 21st century. But what happened all of a sudden that we're seeing this just sort of?
That's a good question. And there's two issues. What was the sudden and abrupt influence and power of this left-wing progressive project, and how did it affect Jewish people in the United States and our attitude toward Israel, for example? And I think what it was is that, as you know, the left agenda, whether it's in Israel or here or Europe, doesn't appeal to 51% of the people. So they always, as Rahm Emanuel said, need a crisis. They can't let it go to waste. And we had a series of traumatic shakeups here. The first was the COVID policies, where we shut down the entire nation. We've never done that. We isolated people. We stopped schools. And then we really terrorized and suppressed anybody. Scott Atlas, my colleague, is a good example. Jay Bhattacharya, my other colleague, who suggested, wait a minute, the damage from the quarantine could exceed them. That was taboo. And then on top of that, we had the George Floyd. And the left took that grimace and that kind of horrific smile or whatever it was on Officer Chauvin's face, and transmogrified it into a lie that this was a systematic war on black males. All the statistics showed that encounters with the police, if you take race into the number of people who were encountered versus the number of people who were shot while unarmed, blacks are not shot in any greater number than whites are, based on their encounters with the police, no matter. So then we had 120 days of rioting and arson, $2 billion damage in property, 35 killed, 15,000 officers. And then we had this radical change in voting where 70% of the people no longer in the swing states voted on election day. They voted absentee, mail-in, early voting. And the error rate decreased by a magnitude from 5% usually for the 30% who used to do this to 0.45 in most states. And then we had Donald Trump's loss and anger about the election. All of those put together, I think, served as these crises that people came out of the woodwork and said, the United States doesn't work, we have to gain control. And Joe Biden was the vessel. He was good old Joe Biden from Scranton, who didn't really know where he was, and the Obamas, the Sanders wing, the DI people used him to implement an agenda that didn't have 50% approval, and which is very unpopular. It has to be driven by institutional support, academia, corporate boardroom, media, social media, entertainment, popular culture. All of these institutions are controlled by the left, and they generate false public support. And then the second thing was Israel. And just to get very quickly, why did this erode traditional support for Israel? It has not eroded. If you look at the polls among people who identify as independents or Republicans, it's 75% support. But why did it transmogrify the left to one of its signature characteristics is anti-Semitism? And I think part of the reason was they, in the Middle East, those interests, and we have an enormous number of people here, I think people forget that two things are happening on the campus, and that's what we're really talking about. That's the nexus or the font or the birthplace of it. And we have imported over 1 million Middle East students the last 10 years, and they're fed by Gulf money oil. They pay higher than tuition rates as foreign students.
When you say 1 million, do you mean 1 million total, or do you mean 1 million at any given time?
A million total.
Like
at any given time, we probably have 300,000 or 400,000, almost as many as Chinese students. And they are served by programs that are funded by Middle East Gutter and others in New York. Most Middle Eastern studies programs at the major elite universities are a nexus for political operatives and activism. At the same time that was happening, because of the repertory admissions, white males were reduced from a traditional 70 or 67% proportional representation theories of admission. That meant in the past, if you just used test scores and grades, white and Asian students would make up 95% of the campus. But under affirmative action, that was reduced to 70. And usually, if you go back and look at enrollment at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, say 1970s, 75, Jewish students were 25% of it was a completely merit-based admissions. And all of these universities that we're referencing, right, they've thrown out the SAT as optional, and they have thrown out comparative ranking of high schools so you can calibrate the value of the GPA. The result is Jewish students are going down now on campus to about 5 to 8%. So just to finish, if you're at Stanford or Harvard, there's going to be a huge number of Middle East students. There's going to be a lot of Middle East faculty, a lot of well-funded programs. Israel is going to be sort of demonized in every aspect of popular culture on campus and in instruction. And there's going to be a minute number of Jewish students. And out of that minute number, there's only going to be a few who feel strongly about Israel and the Jewish heritage and tradition. The others will not, they're secular, or they don't want to get into it. And then you have the traditional white students and Asian. They see the Palestinian cause as driving university Middle East politics, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of the majority, so to speak, and they make the necessary adjustments. And that means there's no constituency for Israel on campus, and there's a great constituency of tolerance of anti-Semitism.
That's an extraordinary analysis, just a numerical analysis. I can't imagine that the level of academic achievement is going to go up without SATs, without weighted scores for high schools based on achievement.
If you talk to faculty at these universities, and I have, even before this more radical repertory, even under the affirmative action, there were not enough students admitted, or there, if you could look at it that way, who could do traditional work, or there were too many admitted that could not. And that made the faculty resort to three or four choices. Number one, they had to inflate the grades. So 80% of people at Yale and Harvard get A's. Or they had to change the curricula so it would be watered down. You look at the names of the courses, comic books, transgenderism, they're popular culture courses. Or three, they have to, if you have a traditional class called Studies in Shakespeare, they will read 1 or 2 plays rather than 9. And this is all below the radar. And even that is not enough. So when you go to these campuses and you look what's going on at student government or the faculty senate, it's motion after motion after motion that special admit students, DEI students, should be given extra time during exams. They should not be required to be punctual. They should not be, if you are a faculty member, and I've talked to faculty members, and they will all say the same thing: I'm not going to die on the altar of DEI and then be cataloged as a systemic racist because my grade reflects actual performance, and therefore some DEI students are overrepresented in the C and D categories. This is really hurting America's competitiveness, as you can see, because we're not turning out.
I mean, what about science and math?
It's happening in science and math slowly.
You can send out.
It's happening, absolutely. But it's happening to the degree that if you were to talk to, off the record, CEOs in Silicon Valley, and I talked to a lot of them because I worked there, they will tell you privately that if it's a choice between hiring a Georgia Tech or a Texas A&M coder or programmer and one out of the supposedly best program in the United States, Stanford University, they would prefer a Georgia Tech person because not only will they be better trained, they will be more likely to have been admitted and evaluated according to merit, and they don't have problems. As one person told me not too long ago, I'm getting tired of hiring Stanford students because all they do is go to HR and complain. And these other students just come in and they do the work and go home.
So they have no work ethic. They have no basic skills. And they feel privileged. They feel like everything should come to them because of the color of their skin. And if it doesn't, then they complain about it. I don't see how America can be a world leader in anything with that kind of graduating class. So you're not graduating STEM graduates who know math and science at the same rate that you were in the past. The elite universities are collapsing into a morass of DEI retardation. And you have a situation where the people who are most meretricious are being punished for being gifted because of the color of their skin. I mean, this is a recipe for, like you said, utter collapse. And you went through the debt crisis, the financial implosion, the military crisis, which we discussed, and the race and the sexuality, lawlessness, education, and sovereignty at the border. I mean, it looks like, the footage coming out of the Texas border area really makes you feel like the United States of America is on the brink of a civil war, where you have the Texas National Guard that's supported by 25 other National Guards, I guess, or at least governors willing to support them against federal troops who are trying to take down concertina wire. How close to a civil war do you think that America is to actually opening fire between state troopers and the
That's
Army?
not going to happen because
crazy.
when they poll the federal border officers there in ICE, most of them are best friends with the Texas National Guard. They have a daughter or cousin that's in the state, or a Texas National Guard person at the border has a brother that's in ICE. They live in the same town. If you look at the ICE people, 90% of them object to what they've been ordered to do. So I don't think there's going to be unless he tries to bring in federal non-Texas troops. But I guess the left is in they don't know what to say, because of course they nullified federal law, and they told us for 30 years that morality trumped the law as they saw it. So we have 550 sanctuary city jurisdictions. The question is, why does the Biden administration allow this to happen? And they say, well, we don't have the resources, or we all know that that's a lie, because the border after 2019 was closed. Trump finally defeated all of the lawsuits, all of the internal apostates who tried to sabotage his executive orders, and he finally closed the border. And then they stopped, they reinstituted catch and release. They reinstituted that you could apply for refugee status here. They stopped the wall, etc. And why did they do it? And I think the answer is they feel that these are constituents for as I said, the progressive project. A lot of us thought, well, it's a long term, because their children will be either amnestied or born in the United States as citizens with anchor baby protections. But I think it's more now that the certification and mail balloting or motor voter, all of that stuff is taken over, where you just mail out ballots to anybody who comes in contact with a state agency. So if you're in Texas or California, anywhere, you go in for disability, you go and get in to register your trailer for registration, you go in to apply for a building permit, you're going to be automatically registered to vote with no certification. They feel that out of this 8 million people, they'll get a lot of people in the 2024 election that will be able to vote.
In terms of what you were talking about with the Civil War thing, just to go back to it for a second, we have a similar issue here in Israel that I know you're aware of, which is that we have sort of a ruling class that's very progressive, and they're pushing policies that are opposed by the rank and file. And, we have, just like you do, we have a general staff in the Army that's very progressive and also very tied at the hip to the Pentagon and to the progressives in the U.S. military general staff. And then you have our field officers who are very much not that way. They're much more religious. They're much more nationalist. They're definitely not progressive. And so we have had this conversation in Israel over the past, several decades about whether or not you can expect the government to order a mass expulsion of all the Jews from Judea and Samaria, or parts of Judea and Samaria. We have 500,000 people who live in Judea and Samaria. And the question is, how would the military respond to such an order? And people say, well, the general staff would order it, but they wouldn't really have the forces to enact the order because people aren't going to be, on such a mass scale being willing to um, to destroy their own homes and to throw their parents out of their homes, etc., and their brothers and sisters. So they're not going to do it. And then we have in our general staff people calling for, and we see the weeding out of these officers with incorrect politics before they can reach division commander. Certainly, they'll never get to be a geographical command commander, central command, or southern command, or northern command, etc. So, do you have that in America too? That they're just pushing everybody out? Is that what's? And if so, then you can foresee a situation where 10 years hence, if this keeps up, or 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, who knows? I mean, you would be able to foresee something like that, where you have woke officers on the ground at the Rio Grande opening fire on stadies.
That's, in theory, what should happen, but the left is encountering some speed bumps. One of them is that the communities along the Rio Grande Valley, to take Texas as an example, but it's also true in Arizona and to a lesser extent in the Coachella Valley, they're primarily second and third generation Mexican-American families. And their families are overrepresented as ICE officers or local state officers. And their communities are impacted. And what do I mean by impact? That means if they have local control of the school and they've fought for advanced placement to get their kids competitive, suddenly they have to have bilingual education. Or suddenly they have people in their community who go to school and they're in a cartel gang, or the children of cartel members, or they're in M16 or Norteños or Sureños. It's happening in my community. And they'll call a third generation Mexican-American guy a gringo because he doesn't speak Spanish. So what I'm getting at is there is a big pushback from a traditional constituency of the Democratic Party. And they're saying, you people are elitist and you don't know what this is doing to us. And the Democratic elite say, but you're Latino. Latinos are always liberal. Same thing has happened in the inner city. When red state governors started busing all of these people, not all of them, but a high percentage, say 20 or 30% to Chicago, to New York, to Baltimore, to Los Angeles, suddenly all of these people saw the actual concrete manifestations of their ideology. And all of a sudden, they turned out to be surprisingly candid and illiberal. They said, we don't want these people. They're defecating in the park. They leave urine jars on my doorsteps.
They're dangerous
they're criminals, and we don't
Yeah.
want them. So the Democratic Party now, as they go into this election, are weighing the idea of, we're going to get voters and the elites want them, but Donald Trump, if he were to be the nominee and he's out of legal trouble, he could get 45% of the Latino vote, 15 to 20% of the black vote. And given his alienation of the white male working class, he's lost about 70% of it. He couldn't win the election. Joe Biden could not, if that were to sustain. So suddenly they've decided now maybe they might make a half-hearted effort to close the border. And Biden keeps saying, give me the tools. Well, he has the tools. He just refuses to use them.
That actually is interesting. We're talking about the third generation Latin Americans and Black Americans. I actually saw a quote saying that he made that Trump may end up getting up to a quarter of Black American vote. And that brings you to the Jewish vote, because you're seeing, I'm wondering how sustained this is, but, a lot of American Jews tested that they woke up, or they went to bed on October 6th progressive, or woke, and they went to sleep on October 7th Jewish. And, you're seeing a lot of these liberal philanthropists, Jewish philanthropists who have been major givers to institutions like Harvard and MIT and University of Pennsylvania was the first one, I think, that was hit by it, said that they're just not going to give any more money to them. And they were facing a deluge of cancellations of support in the millions, in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions in some cases, from Jewish donors. And on the one hand, there's a sense that, well, they're making it up with foreign donations from countries like Qatar, and so they're not going to care that much, and Jewish money isn't as important for universities as it once was. But then you do see that Harvard and University of Pennsylvania, still not MIT, did fire their presidents who couldn't say that, calling for genocide of Jewry is something that shouldn't be acceptable on their campuses. So, I mean, you see this pendulum swinging, and the question, I guess, is it going to have any sort of impact on this progressive revolution that's happening? Are the people who have been enabling it all along going to do a 180 and say, no, we're not doing this anymore. We're stopping, either because of elections or because they are seeing, like Nancy Pelosi, you mentioned when we were talking before we started recording, she was picketed outside of her house by these anti-Semitic Hamas supporters. Tony Blinken also had apparently rioters outside of his house accusing him of genocide the other day. So, you have these are very progressive politicians, and yet the revolution is devouring them.
I think, well, yesterday, Ken Griffith, a big donor, Jewish American, said that he was giving no more money to Harvard. He's given $500 million in total. He stopped. So it's a ripple effect. So when you have Ackman and Griffith and other people who are stopping, then the second-tier donor of any ethnic or religious background doesn't really matter. They then say, wow, if he's not giving it, then I'm not going to give it. So it has a ripple effect. That's one thing. The second thing that's happening simultaneously is there's people who have bought this lie that these are private universities, because we're talking about the most influential institutions. Not that they don't happen at California State Bakersfield, they do. But the sign and the direction and the signature, it all starts at the elite of this anti-Semitism pro-Hamas. So they have done things that people don't really know outside the United States. So when they start desecrating the National Cemetery on Wilshire Boulevard in LA, or they throw red blood paint on the Lincoln Memorial, or they try to disrupt the Christmas celebration and tree in Rockefeller Center, that starts to get a lot of people angry. And then, in addition to that, there's the government. And the government now discovers, everybody like us have been screaming at that for a long time, and they never had paid attention. They said, well, they're great institutions, they help R&D, but now they're starting to understand that ultimately far more important than the private donors is the government, because the government gives the income on the endowment, $50 billion at Harvard, $40 billion at Yale, $38 billion at Stanford, mostly tax-free, and that's half their budget. And that's why you have all these DEI people. If you were to tax the endowment income, or just say that if you're going to give the billions of dollars in research grant money, and you were going to insist they follow constitutional statutes, free speech, non-discrimination, or you would say, if they were to say the $2 trillion that we give in student loans, and 30% of them are in arrears, $2 trillion. We're not going to do it anymore. Let the private sector, because every time we guarantee a loan, you guys raise your rate of tuition higher than the rate of inflation. And now there are legislation in the Congress for all of that, to eliminate that. And if you were to get a Republican Senate, I think they're going to hold the House and increase it, and you had a Republican president, they would act. They're already talking about it. So this has put a fear of God into these universities. And what does that fear of God manifest? At Stanford, for example, they had to have an anti-Semitism committee. I mean, it's been a long time. Everybody understood. We had a Stanford lecturer, actually, who divided up his Jewish students, said, get over to that side of the class, leave your computer on this side, and see how apartheid feels. And they suspended him, even though there's a big movement to bring him back by students. But when we make these anti-Semitism committees, as Harvard just did, what's funny is they're under all this scrutiny about who's on them, and then they appoint people who have a history of anti-Semitism, usually Jewish professors. And it's out of Genesis and the whole Lot story, when he bargains with God, 50 good people, 40, 30, 10. Can you find 10 anti-Semites? 10 people on campus that are not anti-Semites to be on the anti-Semitism, and they can't. And that's happened at Harvard, it's happened at Stanford, and it just reminds people that these universities are hopeless in their present condition. They have to be radically forced to change by financial pressure.
Well, I think that brings us, though, to the Biden administration. Walter Russell Mead wrote a column at the Wall Street Journal yesterday where he talked about just how the biggest catastrophe, at least in foreign affairs, maybe in general, of the Biden presidency to date, is the mess in the Middle East. And he noted that really every president since Nixon suffered, was unable to extricate the United States from the Middle East because you try to get away and it just follows you, whether it's the OPEC oil embargo in 1973 or the, 9/11 bombings, whatever you want to look at. Anytime you try to turn your back on it, it comes back. And now he was mentioning, look, the U.S. appeasement policy of Iran has collapsed. And in a way, it's sort of like the border, right? Like it's totally collapsed. And Iran's proxies are attacking America's closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, and they're also attacking America. And you would think that just like, the mayor of New York is waking up to the illegal immigration problem in his city and trying to figure out what to do about it, that the Biden administration would say, okay, let's reverse course. Let's learn the lessons of the failure of this thing. Let's change. We're making a mistake. But they're doing the exact opposite. They're doubling down and they're trying to run away and capsize Israel's war by under-equipping our military with the munitions that the Americans are supposed to be committed to providing us in emergencies. And they're nickeling and diming us and making us justify every shell, and it's coming too slow. And they're threatening us, and they're trying to coerce us into this hostage deal, which nobody in Israel wants. I mean, 65% of Israelis polled said they didn't want it, and only, I think, 28% said that they could see a deal that would involve releasing all the terrorists in our prisons for the hostages. But it's less than a third, and so they're going with less than a third of Israelis, and they're going against 2/3 of Israelis, going against the prime minister. It's like they're just doubling down. They're doubling down on their hostility to us. They're trying to make a deal with Iran that will let the U.S. remove its forces from Iraq. So why isn't there any lesson learning on the part of the Biden administration, the way there seems to be among, the Jewish alumni and the Latinos on the border and the blacks in the inner cities? Why is the administration doubling down?
As Jake Sullivan said, about a month before October 7th, he said when he looked at his various theater portfolios, he looked at the Middle East and there was essentially no problems there. So he never had to worry about the Middle East. It was so calm. And what he was referencing is that finally the Trump people got their act together and they got out of the Iran deal permanently. No more discussions. They killed Soleimani. They put in $90 billion of oil. They starved Iran. They had a Houthis terrorist label. They cut off the money to Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. They had the Abrams Accord. They were, if you look at what that administration finally did, they said to Israel, I don't see a problem why the embassy can't be in Jerusalem. I don't see a problem why the Golan Heights shouldn't be Israeli. And they were very conducive to Israeli interest. And the result was there was no light between our ally, and people knew you couldn't try things. So the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to change all this. So everything I just mentioned, they reversed. And it didn't take long until they blew up the Middle East. And now they're panicking, and you ask, why haven't they seen the consequences of this deliberate destruction of the prior protocols that had created stability and deterrence? And the answer is, number one, it's an election year. And they are terrified of the young Arab voter. There's not very many of them. They keep saying we're going to vote against Biden, but there's only about 1 million Arab American voters that identify as such in a huge electorate. But unfortunately for the Democrats, they are in swing states that are even. So if you take a state like Michigan or Wisconsin or Arizona, they feel that if you had 30 or 40,000 committed voters that stayed home or voted against Biden, that could lose them the election. That's number one they're thinking about.
They can lose a lot more moderates and independents if they continue on with this.
But they don't
insanity,
think like that.
Can't
They think
I mean,
as
don't they see the
leftist, and they don't look at the polls and say, why is Joe Biden in the ABC poll polling 33%? And the answer is just what you said, that they're so extreme that they've alienated people. They don't understand that if they really wanted to help the Democratic cause, they would lambast all of these violent pro-Hamas demonstrations, and each day they get more violent and they turn off more people. They shut down the Golden Gate Bridge, the Manhattan. People are sick of it, but they don't understand. They see it's an election. The second is, anytime there's an attack on an American installation, 170 to 200 of them, they always say three things. Number one, we will reply at the time and place of our choosing, and we know that usually is not much. And then second, they always say, although it is clear that Iran has supplied these surrogates, we have no direct evidence of Iranian involvement. And number three, they say, and we will respond in a fashion that does not prompt a wider Middle East war. And they know that signals these people that they can go ahead. So now we're in this situation where the Hezbollah surrogates, Iran surrogates, they all say this. What is the magic number that we reach killing Americans or attacks where they'll do something? Is it 150 attacks, 200? We've killed 3, 4, 5, 6 Americans. We've wounded 70, 80, 90. At what point will they actually do something? So what we're doing, we're going to increase and ratchet it up till we get to the point where even Joe Biden might react, and then we'll just keep it calm for a little bit. And that's where we are. They feel that they've hit a point right now where it's so egregious that the United States might have to react. So they're going to go through this typical Middle East protocol where they say, well, we're not going to do it anymore for a while. And then they think we're going to forget, and we will. And then they're going to resume again. And we've lost, because of Afghanistan and Ukraine and the Chinese balloon and all that, we've lost all deterrence. And it's very hard to restore. So the odd thing about it is this guy, Joe Biden, does everything he can to avoid a theater war, and he's doing everything he can to guarantee it. Because at some point, these people are going to get so full of themselves and they're going to do something really crazy, like hit a carrier, and then they're going to be forced to act. So I think that's where we're headed. If he doesn't do something very quickly, and I don't think he will reply in a muscular fashion, Iran is so crazy, they're going to start rationing it really up. And then, especially when they know every time in American history when we have a weak president, like a Jimmy Carter, and he's either close to an election or he's lost the election, the Middle East heats up, because they know something's coming in. They knew Reagan was coming in, and they knew Nixon was coming in '68. They know Trump may be coming in. And if we get close to the election and Biden is not doing well, they're going to really ratchet it up, because they're going to say this is a window, a gift that we've been given, and with crazy Trump comes in, we don't know what he's going to do. But we do know what predictable Joe Biden will not do, and that's a chance to increase our stature. And it really reminds...
Well, that's really the question. I mean,
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I look at John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, who's shocked me. I don't know. I mean, he shocked a lot of people because he came in, aside from the fact that he clearly has damage to his cognitive capacity due to the stroke that he suffered during the election campaign before the 2022 election. But he's totally progressive in domestic affairs. I would assume he's for an open border and all kinds of things, but he keeps waving the Israeli flag in front of the faces of all of these progressive demonstrators. And he doesn't care, and he's just standing his ground. And he put up the photographs of all the Israeli hostages on the door of his Senate chambers. I mean, this is I don't know how to get my arms around what he's doing, but at a minimum, it appears that what he's saying very clearly is there's no reason why progressives have to be anti-Semites. And I don't know whether that's true or not, because you've just gone through this taxonomy of equality of, and you're not obviously, I mean, you're not the only one who said it, but the equality of result outlaws meritocracy, and Jewish advance in America and really in the world has always been on the basis of merit as minority populations, or as one Jewish state in the entire world. And so the idea that merit is bad just sort of inherently requires you to hate Jews and reject them. But here he's saying that you can, we can have exceptions, and here this is an exception. So, I mean, again, it seems like he's showing that he's insisting that you can be a progressive and not hate Jews. And
although he's in a wider,
it just, I guess the rigidity
he's in
of
a
it
wider transformation. So this week he said he no longer felt he was a progressive. He's a Democrat, he said, not a progressive. And then he said he did not see why the border should not be closed. So it's part of an overall realization that he's not going to support it's more going back to Bill Clinton Democrat ideology, and that's unusual today. It doesn't exist.
I mean, maybe that's even more instructive. Maybe that's even more instructive than that. I mean, again, like, it just, you're going into an election year. The entire world is exploding due to your complete incompetence in being the steward of American foreign policy, whether it's the military and the way that you've been treating white males. Excuse me, whether it's with Ukraine and essentially inviting Putin to invade, whether it's in Israel. I mean, like, everything is collapsing. You have ample opportunity. You're turning off many more voters through this failed policy than you would be through a successful one. So do you think that they are just rigid ideological progressives that are dictating the Biden administration's policies?
Yeah, I think the people who are running the country right now is a mixture. I think Jill Biden, who is very left-wing, is the conduit to, she's the puppeteer that tells her husband what to do. And who is telling her what to do, because she's not known to be especially politically gifted, is the Obamas. We know they're the first presidential couple that did not leave Washington. Obama gave a very revealing interview not too long ago where he said his dream of a presidency, somebody asked him about a third term, and he said, my dream would be just to dial in instructions to the president and not have to go through the ceremony. It was almost a narrative of what he's actually doing. And it's the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing on the squad. That's who's running the country right now. And we all thought that there's no such thing as a Bill Clinton left-wing Democrat. But apparently there are starting to be people who say, not for the right reasons, that this is amoral what we're doing, but we're going to lose. This could be a 1972 McGovern wipeout if we don't. And so what do? They have a choice, and that would be to change and run on a superior platform, or go around the country and say Donald Trump's going to deny your right for abortion, and it's Donald Trump, he's Hitler, and then get all of the Silicon Valley money, etc. And that's their choice. I think that's what they'll do. This time, I don't think it'll work, because part of to sell that paradigm, they had to say that Joe Biden, unlike the candidates in 2020, they kept saying he's not Pete Buttigieg, he's not Elizabeth Warren, he's not Julian Castro, he's not Cory Booker, he's good old Joe Biden, the moderate Democrat from Scranton, and we will nominate him. And so they all got out of the race. They were promised stuff, cabinet post, influence. They got out, and they anointed Joe Biden. They knew he was non compos mentis, and then they controlled him. And that was the deal. And I don't think they can do that. He can't campaign. He won't be able to debate. I think he'll get to the convention. There'll be a big movement to take his delegates and give them to somebody else. And so we don't know what's going to happen.
So the interesting thing is that the person that everybody's touting as the great savior who will come in at the Democratic convention to save the party is an even more hardcore, rigid, progressive revolutionary by the name of Michelle Obama. So, I mean, this is just
That would be a
doubling down.
catastrophe. She is the most anti-Israeli candidate in the Democratic Party by far, much more so than the other person people talk about, Gavin Newsom, who would be a disaster in his own right. But if she were to be nominated and to win, it would be a disaster for American foreign policy. And I don't think she can win, but I've been optimistic, and sometimes that's clouded my judgment.
Well, so I guess, that it's hard to imagine that she can win when you have 25% of Black Americans who are saying that they would vote for the GOP, or 20%, and because of the policies, because of the outcomes of these progressive policies for their lives, and then they would double down. They would vote for her just because she's Black. I don't know. I mean, maybe. I guess it depends on marketing. You can market anything. But what about Israel in the meantime?
People in this country that you talk to in the defense area or national security are very pessimistic. They feel that sometime from June, July, August, September, October, there's going to be a blow up in the Middle East, and it's going to be connected. It's going to be something to do with Hezbollah and Israel, and as part of that equation, surrogates or Iran are going to do something and attack an America in a way that trumps what we've seen so far. And the Biden administration will be forced to act just everybody is going, and that's something that they fear. And I've talked to people in the Democratic Party that say it's coming, and maybe it'll help Biden because everybody rallies around a president, wartime president. But he has created the conditions by his serial appeasement that it's very hard to see how you're going to have any influence other than military force to correct things. And that's what's sad. And it's going to affect Israel as well, because rightly or wrongly, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran all now believe that there are elements within the United States government that either will not or cannot help Israel. And therefore, they want to exploit that in the next 6 months. That's my view, and it's going to be very dangerous.
That's a question that I wanted to leave you with, which was, a lot of, I hear on Israeli TV a lot of people sort of talking longingly about the possibility of Trump being restored to power in a year, and what that would mean for Israel. And I keep warning people that A, we're a year out and we really have no idea what's going to happen in the United States, and B, we have a year with this administration that we have to cope with. What is your advice to Prime Minister Netanyahu, to the Israeli people looking at this collapse of American culture? You're looking at people revisiting their views from beforehand in the face of the destructive nature they now see being spawned by this revolution that they had at least passively supported in the past, except for this administration, which is doubling down. I mean, what do you tell Israel?
Mr. Netanyahu has to be very quiet, and he shouldn't get into any verbal disagreements. He should say the United States is our strongest ally. We appreciate the help that they have given us. And then he's going to have to act in a way that he feels the majority in his government feel that it's in the interest of Israel. And then he can post facto explain why he had to do it. Anytime that Israel gets in a verbal joust, it's interpreted here as ingratitude. So he doesn't want to do that. And yet, anytime that we, as this administration is doing, tries to interfere in your electoral balloting process or voting, as both Clinton administration and this administration are doing, it doesn't poll well here. So I think Israel just keeps quiet, speaks with sincere gratitude to the help the United States has given, but does not limit itself in the areas that they see as vital. And they just have to do it. And all they have to say is, when they question, we had no choice after October 7th. And if that means taking out a spy ship or protecting your port facilities that come off the Red Sea. It just has to be done. And I think for all of Trump's wild, uncontrolled outburst and occasional crudity and explicitiveness, when you actually look what he did for Israel, it was unsurpassed. And I think he sincerely, and he would do the same thing again. And so we have to get through this period. We have to hope that he's elected, or a Republican like him is elected, because the nomination's not finalized yet. But whoever it is will be just quantitatively superior as far as protecting American interest along in the area, and by extension, by helping our ally Israel. But we have to get to that point, and that's a long way away. The days of people like a Bill Clinton, I didn't think he was a great friend of Israel, but compared to what we have now in the Democratic Party, he was reasonable, somewhat reasonable. But that person doesn't exist. Nobody like that will have a chance. The central element of the Democratic Party will be, whether Joe Biden knows it or not, will be anti-Israel.
Anti-Israel, and I dare say anti-Semitism, which we're seeing on the streets of all of the major cities.
That's
in the
one thing
United
that's
States.
happened in the United States.
I don't think that there can be any argument.
Just final comment.
Yeah, I don't think there can be an argument.
That's the biggest thing that's happened in my life.
What's that?
Is that the old pretense between anti-Semitism is not anti-Israeli. That's dropped now, because when you look at the crowds and what they're chanting, what they're doing, what they're yelling, who they go after, who they try to harass, they by their own admission proudly admit and will brag about Jewishness is the same as Israel, and whether they hate Israel or they hate Jews, it doesn't matter to them. It's all the same entity. And anti-Semitism is the same as anti-Israelism now. It always was but I had never seen them so overt. So by their own admission and by their own words, and they don't see it as anything bad. If you say to a protester on campus, you're really anti-Semitic when you say all this about genocide and they'll say, okay, I don't like you. They admit it. They admit it.
It's amazing. Well, I appreciate it, and I think we're going to have to revisit this again in a couple of months and see what's going on. It seems like it's more of the same, but only after we've won. I don't, Orwell said the quickest way to end a war is to lose it. So I'm not for quick ends to this war. I'm for successful ends to this war. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate so much having you back on the show. Take care.